Hello and welcome to my presentation on the research that I've been conducting over the past 8 months, comparing 3 real-time sound synthesis techniques for expressive sci-fi sound effect generation. I landed on this project because I've always been interested in sound design for film. I always found the ideas behind Foley fascinating, the idea that performing alongside a scene in real time to record sound effects would end up saving time in the editing process. Foley, however, is limited to sounds that have to be created in real time using real objects in real space. But what happens when you want a sound effect that can't be recreated in the real world? Well, then you use digital audio workstations, applying editing and processing to pre-recorded samples. However, this is a time-consuming and tedious process. It requires long hours behind computer screens, ensuring timings are perfect and adding individual layers of processing and effects to each sample. This process, compared to Foley, is massively inefficient. The comparison led me to the idea for a tool that would allow a sound designer to create these sound effects in a manner similar to Foley, using real-time sound synthesis methods and some form of human input. To begin this research, I looked at what was already out there in terms of real-time synthesis and interactive sound design tools. Firstly, I came across Croto Studios. They're a company producing professional sound design tools, and their tool, the Dehumanizer, particularly interested me. It takes in vocal input and transforms it to sound like monsters. This was a huge source of inspiration and led me to look further into vocal input as an option. On the other hand, audio cubes are a product created for music creation. They use position mapping to look at the cube's location in relation to each other, and then use this data to change parameters of the sound. I also looked into different sound synthesis methods and the possibilities within real-time sound synthesis. After looking at these, I made a final decision about where I wanted my research to go. I decided to compare 3 methods of real-time sound synthesis using vocal input as a means to create expressive, abstract sound effects. My aims were to compare 3 contemporary sound synthesis methods, to gather user feedback to gain insight into the creative potential of each method and the features and usability of each tool specifically for a professional setting. And all of this would be to ultimately provide insight into the possibility of a new tool for the sound design industry. The 3 methods chosen for this study were granular synthesis, concatenative synthesis, and real-time variational autoencoder. I thought these 3 would be an interesting selection as they had varying levels of artificial intelligence. Each patch developed was built using existing tools with adjustments made to follow the aims of this particular study. Granular synthesis is the most basic of the 3. It works by slicing an audio sample into tiny segments called grains, usually somewhere from 1 to 100 milliseconds. Based on input, the granular synthesizer will then re-stitch these grains together to create new audio. The granular synthesizer for this project was built using the GrainFlow Max package, specifically the GrainFlow.synth object. The synthesizer would randomly play grains while matching the pitch and volume of the input audio to attempt some sort of recreation. This is an example of the granular synthesizer working. Concatenative synthesis is built off the ideas of granular synthesis, but instead of randomly scrambling the grains to stitch them back together, after the audio sample is split into grains, it uses machine learning to analyze each grain based on a number of factors, such as spectral features and envelope. It also analyzes the incoming audio and then compares the two to find the closest matching grain to play. Concatenative synthesis attempts to recreate the incoming audio as close as possible using the grains from the sample audio provided. This concatenative synthesizer was built using Rodrigo Constanza's SP Tools Max package, which is built off the back of the Flucoma or Fluid Corpus Manipulation Toolkit. It uses the k-nearest neighbor algorithm to compare the real-time audio input with the pre-analyzed corpus for a more accurate representation of the input audio. Here's an example of that one in use. variational autoencoder is a generative machine learning model trained on a large non-numerical dataset to generate samples closely related to the original training data. Autoencoders store complex data as an abstract representation in latent space. Where regular autoencoders map the data points to a fixed position in latent space, a variational autoencoder maps the data point to a probability distribution in the latent space. This allows for smoother transitions and therefore more realistic recreations. For the variational autoencoder, I used Rave, a real-time audio variational autoencoder. It's a pretty new generative model built to prioritize speed and quality. It uses 128-dimensional latent space, allowing for lower sample rates and improved efficiency. And here's an example of that one. Wow. Each patch also had an audio input channel, so the synthesizers were constructing the sounds based on incoming audio rather than any other data source. They had effects control, which included optional reverb and filtering. This allowed for more variation with the sound and more creative opportunity. And finally, an XY plane. The users would move around the plane to control any adjustable parameters, taking away time-consuming nature of finely adjusting each individual parameter. This allowed the process of creating the sound effects to be more dynamic and creative. Once the prototype patches were built, I went on to design an experiment to get user feedback. I wanted to see how people would interact with the tools, to see how usable they were, and see how much potential they saw within them for creating interesting sound effects quickly. For the study, 10 sound design students from undergraduate and postgraduate degree programs took part. Sound design students were chosen as this tool was developed for a professional setting, therefore people with sound design experience were preferable. Ethical approval was obtained prior to the study and all participants provided informed consent. All 3 synthesis tools were set up with water sounds as their sample or training audios to ensure there was no bias here. The order of the tools was also randomized, and the participants were not told which tool they were using to ensure that no one had any preconceived ideas. Each session lasted about 30 minutes. For each tool, they were given a short introduction and then 5 minutes to experiment. Once they had done this for each tool, they were asked to fill in a survey where they were asked what they liked and disliked. These questions were left intentionally open-ended to encourage rich, qualitative feedback, and to rank the tools for some quantitative feedback as well. They were reminded throughout this process that the focus was on creativity and not realistic reconstructions. Interestingly, while the Rave patch scored highest in the rankings, a closer look at the written responses suggests the picture's a bit more complicated. Creatively, the granular synthesizer offered the most potential. It created great, short, abstract sounds that the users felt would be good in a science fiction setting. However, they were not realistic and could be slightly too unpredictable. By contrast, Rave, while producing the most technically polished sounds, was often described as limiting creatively. It produced highly realistic water-like textures, but several users felt they couldn't stray from these sounds, and thus dulled their creative engagement. Concatenative synthesis fell somewhere in the middle, with users saying it was more creative than realistic. Rave had the lowest latency and was most reactive across a range of vocal inputs, which is critical for real-time use in a professional setting, whereas the granular synthesizer ended up having some latency issues. And while the concatenative synthesizer didn't struggle too much with latency, it was temperamental and difficult to get a response. This was due to the technique's attempts to find a closely related grain to the incoming audio. As the sample audio was high-frequency water sounds, it performed best in response to s and sh sounds, providing little to no output for lower frequency input. In terms of versatility, granular synthesis showed the most range. Users could create everything from pretty realistic river sounds to more strange, otherworldly textures. Concatenative synthesis was good at generating short, transient sound effects. And rave, though less diverse output, was the best for creating continuous ambient textures. So what did we learn from all of this? This data showed me the importance of gathering both quantitative and qualitative data. Granular synthesis was the least liked quantitatively, but generated the most positive feedback for creative potential and tonal variety. Whereas rave's polished, realistic output influenced the ratings positively, despite users mentioning the lack of its abstract creative potential. This contrast taught me a lot, and reminded me that even if a tool feels more realistic, it doesn't actually mean that it's better suited for the creative purpose. And so where do we go from here? The most promising idea moving forward is a hybrid tool that combines all three synthesis methods. Rave would handle the ambient, longer textures, great for background sounds, whereas granular and concatenative synthesis could fill in the shorter, diegetic sound effects. This would allow users to blend and switch between these synthesis methods, providing a richer, more expressive sound design experience. Users could create full soundscapes from one single tool, dynamically adjusting and layering sounds in real time quickly. This study used graphical user interfaces, but a more engaging route would be to use a tangible user interface that would allow a sound designer to physically shape the sounds, similar to Foley. This could make interaction more expressive, more intuitive, and even more emotional. To conclude, this research set out to explore how real-time sound synthesis could offer a faster, more expressive alternative to traditional sound design, especially for abstract sound effects. This study showed that real-time sound synthesis shows promise in the future of sound effect creation. Through comparing granular, concatenative, and variational autoencoder-based synthesis, we discovered that no single method is perfect. While Rave gave the cleanest results, the granular and concatenative tools offered more abstract creative textures. The idea of merging these methods into one hybrid system opens exciting possibilities in the future of sound design, allowing creators to shape entire sonic worlds in real time. And by exploring more interactive, tactile forms of control, bringing it back to the ideas from Foley, we might be able to bridge the gap between physical performance and digital synthesis. Thank you for listening.